but it has been,
Stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch all day. Thank you.
How's it going? I am James Clement. I'm the managing web editor here at The Real Deal, and we are here for yet another episode of TRD Talks Live. And today we're going to be talking about bars and restaurants and really generally just kind of the future of hospitality. So we've got a few really awesome folks with us today, some real leaders of the industry. So I want to get right into it and introduce them. We have Stephen Kamali. He is the CEO of Hospitality House, and they're definitely, without question, one of the leading food and beverage consulting groups out there. Brokers a lot of deals. He knows pretty much everybody in the industry. So thank you, Stephen, for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you. And we also have Bill Bonbrest. He's the COO of Tao Group. I think everybody knows Tao Group. And they have a fleet of upscale nightclubs, bars, restaurants all over the world. Probably, about 50 of them, Bill?
About 44, yep.
Awesome. And we also have Michael Stillman, who is the founder and the president of restaurant group Quality Branded. And they have about 10 properties here in New York City. And then we've also got spaces out in, I believe, Denver and Miami. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate you guys being here. I know things are pretty stressful and everybody's cooking at home or getting food delivery. So with that in mind, I figured we'd jump into the first question, which is on my mind. And it is, where is the first restaurant you're going to eat as soon as you get done with whatever it is we're going through right now? Bill, do you want to start?
Sure. I would like to eat at my own restaurants. And I miss the food in our places a lot. We've, on our daily partner calls, we're always talking about the dishes that we love from Tao and Lavo and our other places. And so we're hopeful that we're going to get delivery and takeout is going to be the first segment that's going to go out. And we're currently looking at centralizing, in New York at least, one kitchen where we can do some of the highlights from our menus from other, not just Tao, but also Beauty and Essex and Lavo and some of our other restaurants. So that's for us, the takeout and delivery will probably be the first ramp up. We have a place in Chicago, a Tao in Chicago, a restaurant and a nightclub, and we're looking to open that first. We closed everything down as of March 23rd. Our first priority was the safety of our crew and our guests, so we closed everything, and we're just now starting to look at takeout and delivery, and in the markets that we operate in. So that's what we're looking at, and I can't wait to eat our own food.
That sounds good. Michael, do you have a place in mind?
It's very good. Very good answer. I mean, we definitely miss a lot of the restaurants that we have and a lot of the stuff we're doing there. I definitely also have a couple places in mind that are, second generation and third generation New York City places. I eat at Elio's a lot on the Upper East Side, and those sort of mom and pop places that have been around, that have been institutions that I miss. Most of all, beyond even the food, is just the atmosphere. And I know how challenging it's going to be for restaurateurs, especially ones that have small boxes like that, to be able to handle the next piece of this. And I think I'm excited and motivated to help support them too, because it's going to be so challenging for all of us. And those people who've been there for generations to try and navigate that. I'm just excited to get a little bit of that spirit back and that feeling back, and to be able to support that piece of it. So those are a couple of the ones Elo's came to mind, but there are a lot of those people. And those are ones I'm really excited to go to.
That sounds good. Stephen, you have a place? Where do you want to go?
In all fairness, I think I just want to get back to my regular schedule. So I have breakfast at a diner around the corner from me on the Upper East Side. That would be nice. I was thinking a pastrami sandwich from 2nd Avenue Deli for lunch. And for dinner, I'll leave that open and to your imagination, but there's lots of places I'd like to go. But somewhere probably, really anywhere that it would be nice to see a lot of people and to be out and about. So I'll leave it there.
Some pretty good spots. Everyone at this point, New York wants to know when this is going to open up, when Governor Cuomo is finally going to lift the order. It sounds like May 15th is going to be the day for some places in upstate New York, but not down here in the city. Do you guys have any predictions based on what you've seen when you expect you can kind of get business ramping up again? like sit down business?
I don't. I really don't have a clue. And the scary part for us is that I think to a certain extent, whoever opens up first for a la carte dining, at least, is going to lose, because, from where I sit, it seems like restrictions are going to be in place around capacity for sure. And around steps of service, and new protocol. If I see one more deck on a coronavirus pandemic relaunching plan, I'm going to be sick. Really, it's just overwhelming how much information there is out there and no certainty. So I think that for us, I think that, as I said earlier, takeout and delivery is the real opportunity, and the first opportunity, and trying to pivot in a way that we can consolidate, do a bunch of our places' menus out of one centralized kitchen, and then maybe even come up with some packages, meal replacements and whatnot, for those people who may still be at home. That's kind of the first look for us.
Yeah, I would agree with Bill's sentiment. I mean, we're targeting anywhere from July 4th to Labor Day, and that's a pretty wide swath, and it could be even later. And I think our concern is also not that time, but really like a 50% occupancy restricted time. I think for a lot of people, there's a concern that financially is probably worse in a lot of ways than being fully closed. And I think a lot of people are unaware with how tight restaurants' margins are, and that being open 50% is probably a more damaging time frame. But our desire to be open and to be part of the community and to try and, revitalize the restaurant industry is pulling at us from the other direction. I think in an ideal world, we would want to see the government tell us when we could open at an appropriate moment where there were restrictions, but restrictions that were more realistic for, say, New York City restaurants to operate, because sort of saying, hey, you can open, but at 50% is financially almost worse than staying closed. So that is a big challenge point, I think, for us, trying to figure out how long that would be is maybe even a trickier and more nerve-wracking thing that we're really focused on.
I think, James, consumer confidence is probably more important than an opening date. And I think ultimately suppressing sales by 30, 40, 50% for the restaurant industry is an impossibility should they want to remain open for any long period of time and remain successful. And so I think ultimately the real question is, when are people prepared to go out? When is the government going to place less restrictions on seating capacity? And ultimately, when can the experience feel as natural as it once had? Otherwise, I think you're going to find that folks like Bill and Michael and the others are going to continue to pivot their business models. But, we're encouraging folks to not open until such time that they feel as though the consumer is going to come back. And I think ultimately to open prematurely would really be the death of the food and beverage industry. And so at this point in time, I think it's more about consumer confidence, and there being a higher regard for safety is ultimately going to place a lot of emphasis on this social distancing within the restaurant space, which unfortunately doesn't bode very well for these businesses.
Sure. You mentioned the kind of the issues with consumers and whether they're ready, but even more to the point, let's say they are ready, but their spending power is dramatically reduced. How many restaurants are going to be able to weather, let's say 1 million New Yorkers remain out of work. Let's say that the 70 million tourists who come here every year, maybe half of them or fewer end up in the city. How many restaurants could survive that kind of hit?
So if I could just speak to the number of restaurants, and I'll leave it to the experts. I would tell you that we conducted a survey only 2 weeks ago of the restaurant industry, and of the 2,000 or so restaurants that we reached out to and had conversations with and were able to survey, 20% are handing back their keys and foregoing continuing in the industry, which is tremendous. And I think, unfortunately, that number climbs to 40%, if not 50%, over the next 6 to 8 months as the PPP dollars run out And until such time that a lot of these folks are able to then reopen and realize that the business and the power of spending is not there in the same way that it once was. And ultimately, I think that will become the moment of reckoning where we'll really realize how many folks in the restaurant industry are going to make it to the other end.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with Stephen. I do believe long-term, I believe in New York City. I believe in the power of New York City and the power of restaurants in general. I feel like over the next 5 to 10 years, before this, there was a vision that commercial tenants were being replaced to some degree by more experiential things, restaurants. We were starting to get a foothold and a recognition that, online consumerism could handle, buying your bank or your drugstore stuff, but they couldn't fully, replicate the experience of restaurants. And I still believe long-term, there's a real value and a power of restaurants as an experiential anchor tenant for things. I think it's fighting through the next couple of years, and I think it's challenging. I think small owners have to be really focused on working capital. And I think Stephen's right. It's going to be a lot more onerous than they may think during that time period. And I think they need to hopefully try and find the right balance with their landlords, who also have a lot to deal with, trying to find this sort of right balance to if they're a strong candidate to survive, how do we together get through this period so that over a 10-year period, we can both do the best we can do. And I think we're focused a lot on trying to make deals that make sense for both parties over the long term. If they believe like, hey, restaurants can still be the new anchor tenant in the new world, and I believe they can be. I think even more maybe in the long term than, retail stores, which aren't being talked about as much now for good reason, but 5 years from now, I think that could be a tougher situation. I feel like my father finally figured out how to use Amazon. How many other guys his age can now suddenly use Amazon? But he's still going to go to a restaurant in the long run, I believe.
Anything to add to that?
No, I was just thinking when Michael referenced his dad, who I was fortunate enough to meet, and I came up in the business with my dad as a restaurateur as well. And I was thinking like what our dads would do if they were owning and operating in this environment. And I don't know, I think my dad would say, stay focused on the people part of it, stay focused on the guest experience. And what Michael said is really towards the confidence that if we continue to find a way to deliver a great guest experience, that it will all come back. And we have some restaurants and some nightclubs in Las Vegas, and that's such a convention-driven town. And I also am really cognizant of the fact that the consumer confidence that Stephen referenced is got to be there in terms of on the corporate level too, in terms of these companies coming back into places like Las Vegas and Chicago and having conventions again. And so I'm thinking about that as well.
Have you guys had conversations with your landlords already?
We have. We've had a lot of conversations with our landlords in each market, and some are a lot more open to being some of them have a lot more leeway to be a lot more flexible and a lot more reasonable and a lot more generous with us as anchor tenants than others, so it's a mixed bag, and we're doing our best to work through those partnerships, because at the end of the day, they're our business partners, our landlords, and we have some great landlords, and we realize that they're under a lot of pressure too. They are getting a look at the reality of what our business is really like these days. And, it used to be, our margins used to be a lot different 10 years ago than they are now. And that's just the reality of being in the hospitality industry today prior to COVID-19.
Stephen, you have a lot of clients who struck big deals with pretty prominent landlords and really beautiful, interesting spaces in New York. Are they struggling? Are they doing okay right now? What does your client base look like at this point?
So to tell you that the landlords that we've spoken to over the past 6 weeks, the conversations have varied greatly. I would say that more so on the institutional side, the conversations have been far more productive, and I anticipate that that's likely because of their balance sheets and their ability to be quite a bit more amenable. And I feel as though there are many others that have reacted as one would imagine. I need my rent, you have to pay me, and I have to pay my mortgage, and I have to pay my operating expenses, which is incredibly understandable. And I think ultimately what we're trying to do is find that balance whereby which the tenants are able to hold on to their keys and to be able to hold out and wait until such time that they're able to then open. Because the last thing we want to see is having these landlords to have to replace all of these tenants at some point in time in the near future. Which unfortunately the outlook is rather grim in the sense that we don't know whom those tenants are going to be, who's going to have the ability to capitalize an opening of a restaurant, and what their aptitude and their willingness to pay rent is going to be. And so I think quite a few have landed in the very middle of the dialogue and said, hey, I'd like to learn more about the restaurant industry. How can I become a bigger part of the conversation with these tenants? And would it make sense for me to partner with them in some way? And I think that willingness and that openness, the eagerness to be able to be part of the discussion and to be open-minded about it has resulted in really productive discussions. So again, for people that have the capacity to financially, I think that it's in their best interest to be able to engage in a positive dialogue with these tenants and to understand where their pain points lie and really what their margins are. To Bill's point, I think that education will help them at least to understand the perspective of their tenants.
What's really interesting is you talk a little bit about, different models potentially, and landlords working with different tenants on the restaurant side. Are there maybe in the future possibly no more 10-year leases, that perhaps it's some sort of a profit sharing model, or maybe like a hotel based model where it's more of like a management, agreement with the operator?
I think, so 10 years ago when I started the discussion with hotel owners about operating agreements, license agreements, that there was no longer discussions about leases. It was not something that was very commonplace. And over time, what you have found is, and most of our work, about probably 80% of our work sits within the hotel space. And I would tell you today, it's the norm to engage in a management contract or a joint venture agreement with the food and beverage operator. And it's no longer necessarily a lease. And those conversations don't arise as often. And so what I would tell you is that I do believe, James, to your point, that it's going to begin to shift that way in the real estate space. And I believe that most landlords are going to find that participating in these ventures with these food and beverage operators is their best opportunity for success. So I do believe that management contracts are going to become far more normalized in the industry. I do believe that there's going to be joint venture partnerships, and we are encouraging them. And that dialogue has already begun, and it's rather productive.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you, Stephen. We have a few excellent questions in the chat, so I figured I could throw a few of them out there. Michael, I'm going to throw this one to you. This is the first question. It is from Sonia Verney, and she asks, how do you plan on following social distancing guidelines? Will you start taking reservations where only a certain amount of people are allowed to come within an hour? If so, sign me up as your first reservation.
Well, look, I think, as Bill said, we've seen a huge range of a lot of the information coming out now. We believe we're probably a few months out, and so much can change then, that we're following closely things that are going on in Asia. We have a Smith-Wonsky partnership that opened in Taipei recently. We're partners with our restaurant in Denver with a hotel that's looking to open sooner in the South, in Savannah. So we're talking to them a lot about what they're thinking about and what they're thinking through. I mean, I think consumer confidence is really important, and it's balancing out this desire to get open and build that confidence with what are things that are either so onerous they're unrealistic, or so onerous you can't afford them, and or can you do them at a level that you feel that your consumers will be really comfortable with, and what's the right balance. And a lot of these things are very important, but they fly in the sort of, face of a lot of things that, particularly in our culture and in restaurant culture, people are not used to. I mean, fundamentally, social distancing is sort of the opposite premise of a restaurant experience in a lot of ways. Where the restaurant experience is fundamentally about socializing with other people, socializing with the employees, the dynamics and feeling of that. So I think we're not just thinking through, and we are a lot, all the physical things, all the timing things, all the, how can we do contactless stuff, but we're also trying to think over the long haul of what's the balance, and how can we create what is ultimately the environment that I think people come to restaurants for, in a manner that is safe, and when's the right time to do that and how to do that. So I think we're being thoughtful, and one of the things we're also really thinking about is there a way to do some of these things that may have a long-term value for restaurateurs, that customers might be comfortable with. An example I like is, I think in European culture a lot, you make a reservation and there's a specific time slot. You make a reservation in London and it's from 7 to 9 p.m., where in the US, I think people aren't as used to that. For us with tiny margins, people sort of felt like, hey, I own this table, but that is almost impossible to make sense of financially. Maybe this is a moment where we can balance out and keep people safer with more set time slots, and customers will understand that, and may also understand that there's a financial advantage to restaurants that helps us mitigate all these additional costs and the lack of seats. So there may be wins and ways to slightly change the model if I think our customers are open to them. And I think finding those win-wins, that can be a great health moment, but also can be a good win to keep us operating and focused and being really clear and transparent with those things from a customer perspective, so they understand why we're thinking through them in that way. I think could be really valuable. So we're thinking a lot about that stuff as well.
One question I've always had is, I'm sure that you can cut down on some of the front of house staff if you only have, say, 50% occupancy, but how do you do it in the back of the house? These guys often work in pretty tight quarters. There's just no way to find 6 feet of space.
Bill, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's so counterintuitive. It's so counterintuitive for the heart of the house and for the front of the house. And to Michael's point earlier, it doesn't speak to a great guest experience. Our places thrive on the energy. We believe in guests waiting for tables, not tables waiting for guests. So how do you square that with this idea of social distancing? And I actually love Michael's suggestion around the timing of the reservation. I have a good friend, Nick Kakanis, from the Alinea group in Chicago, and he also owns a reservation platform that's giving Open Table a run for the money called Talk, and he does that at his restaurants in Chicago currently. He's selling an experience that's a timed experience, and he has different, different menus available. And so I think there's a lot to do. I have no idea how you pack a walk station and make it operational with 6 feet in between cooks. I don't have a good answer for that right now.
So that said, Tao has a reputation for being really innovative when it comes to design. Do you see anything in the future that you guys are looking into? You also have nightclubs, and that's, of course, the definition of kind of close quarters, right? So what kind of things are you looking at in terms of your spaces?
It's a great question. What some of the stuff that I'm reading about in the design world is actually that we've been very successful at having these private dining rooms as part of our overall venue. And, maybe we may call it a skybox or a PDR. Everybody has their own name for it, but they've been great for us. They allow us to have, anywhere from 14 to 30 guests in their own space. And so I think that doing some work around for new venues around having more of those spaces is an opportunity. And also I'm reading about certain operators who are currently, reimagining their dining rooms and taking their booths and making them walls for their booths. I don't see doing that for our spaces, but I'm hearing about it, and I think the first piece for us is looking at the takeout and delivery and how we can make that really safe for our crew and for our guests, and how we can cut out the third-party delivery services, or at very minimum, cap their service charges at 10%. There's some good people right now doing some work. There's this platform called IT platform called OLO, which is takeout going right from someone's app into the POS, which is great. We're looking at that. The guys, my friends at Talk, they started a Talk to Go platform. So I think those are the areas that we're looking at first. I haven't gotten to dining room and bar layout. I think that's kind of it's overwhelming to me as an operator to try to think about that, and I don't have any great ideas.
And I think there are two important things there, James, especially for a lot of people in the real estate world to think about. And my father's still around. I talk to him every day. He's 83, and he brought me a little sketch, and he said, what if we build these plastic tents around each table, and they could come up and they could, and I said, that's great. I said, right now, people aren't even allowed to go out. So I'll just somehow find these workers who will be in desperate demand whenever they're allowed to even leave their homes, and somehow find these materials to build these individualized tents around every booth over the next, 2 months, and get them in and operational with the money I don't have and 50% occupancy. How do we do that? Especially when the most onerous restrictions will probably happen the soonest. And then, the value of doing those things, those most expensive things, will hopefully dissipate over months, not years, as hopefully we find treatments and stuff. So the balance is tough. I had a landlord that I said, hey, do you think there's any creative way to try and find some outdoor dining around the building that maybe wasn't allowed before? He said, I'll look. But he said, you're on the second floor, like maybe what if you could find a way to get all the windows to be operable? And I said, I guess I said, I believe that it could cost, several hundreds, thousands of dollars to take a building in Midtown Manhattan and convert, 35 giant windows, let alone the infrastructure to get approvals to get up there to do that. How would I somehow manage to find the money, time, and wherewithal to be able to immediately do that? And by the time I did, would it be winter, and would people no longer be worried about these restrictions? The timing of the most onerous restrictions is coming so fast, and our ability to navigate these fixes with no ability to even go to our restaurants is, I think, a huge challenge. And the delivery, which I think is an interesting outlet, when we are closed, it really does not provide a lot of financial value. And I think sometimes real estate developers don't realize this. Well, you could do delivery. We say delivery has some value when you're already open as a restaurant, because you've got 6 cooks and you maybe can do delivery with the same or one more. But when you're fully closed, it costs you all the 6 cooks and the 25% for the delivery fees, and you rarely sell as much. The price per person is half as much. So it is really a limited profit center, if at all. It's really a way to keep some of your people working, and we want to do that, but we're balancing that out with the potential risk for them. So we've been focused
Michael,
with that.
Could you talk a little bit about what the difference in revenue is between a regular restaurant and a takeout and delivery? Is it like a 30% dip, 50? If you're only doing delivery now.
No,
versus what you typically get.
Look, we're not doing delivery in New York City yet because we were very concerned about the health consequences at first, and we wanted to navigate making sure that our staff was safe, that we would like to do it in time. We just recently restarted in Denver, where the business has been very strong, and there's a lot of pickup in Denver that we didn't expect, which is a big advantage. But, it would maybe be way past what we expected, and it would maybe be 10 to 20% of the revenue on a given night compared to what we did. And once we reopen, I think it will maybe be half that. That's a big number.
James, to your point, I think that venues like cloud kitchens that exist to some extent in New York, but more so across the country, are purpose-built for delivery and purpose-built for pickup. Those have, significantly less real estate costs and are not being utilized for anything other than that use. And we have found success in that model. Unfortunately, the gentlemen on this panel, as an example, have spent millions upon millions of dollars and are paying millions of dollars in rent, building restaurants and leasing restaurants that ultimately are really work for the masses and work on large volumes that weren't necessarily built to then pay 30% delivery fees to some third-party aggregators. But I will tell you that aside from that, I do think there'll be, unfortunately, many restaurateurs that will go out of business that will ultimately look to cloud kitchens as a way to be able to rebuild their businesses. I think fundamentally there'll be a lot of folks that are going to build concepts specific to cloud kitchens. But the notion of full service restaurants, especially of the nature of Michael and Bill's restaurants, to just work on delivery doesn't work. And they're better off just keeping the doors closed, and they're better off keeping their staff at home and on unemployment. And that's the unfortunate truth. So that's where the paradigm shifts. Are there businesses that work for delivery? Yes, but not necessarily a full service restaurant that's doing it ad hoc.
You mentioned cloud kitchens. They haven't really quite taken off, though. I think The Information published a story last week. They bought something like 70 properties across the country, and only 10 of them are operational. And of those 10, they suffered from all kinds of, defects in terms of design and issues. Is it the future, though? Once the model's refined?
We believe it's not we think that it's part of the discussion. It's part of the conversation. I wouldn't say that it's the future entirely, but we do think that it's going to be a significant component in the hospitality industry. We find that it's going to be a wonderful solution for mixed-use developments, like Manhattan West and Hudson Yards could benefit from cloud kitchens to a large extent. Office parks across the country. Hotels, to a large extent, are going to have a hard time keeping their dining rooms full, but we think they could benefit from having multiple food and beverage operators within a cloud kitchen at the base of their building, serving room service and breakfast and the likes. And so we do think that there is opportunity for cloud kitchens. I think you're going to find it in a variety of forms. It's not going to just be standalone parking garages and buildings, which are typically found on the West Coast today. I think to break into the urban marketplaces and gateway cities, the operators are going to have to be very creative and thoughtful. And I think that intuition will ultimately lead to some interesting ideas.
Stephen, can you talk a little bit about the Restaurant Network, which is an organization you helped establish?
The Restaurant Network is something that we brought together. It's effectively a coalition of restaurateurs like Bill and Michael and the likes of them and our colleagues within the industry. It's really become an opportunity, one, to serve as a resource to the restaurant community by giving them access to information, accountants, insurance folks, legal help on the corporate and labor side. Most operators don't own 15, 20, 30, 44, in Bill's case, restaurants. They're folks that own one or two stores that don't have the capacity, the resources to be able to pull together the answers they need. And so I think where we started it was really for the successful reopening of food and beverage operations across the country. It really became a place where people can come to ask their questions, vent a little bit, feel better about the fact that there's others within this organization that are having the same exact troubles they're having. And what we find in not only our social media channels, but our variety of WhatsApp groups across the country is that each and every operator is helping others find solutions to PPP. And they talk about things like, when do we bring our staff back? How do we bring them back? And they get a chance to discuss all the challenges they're facing. And candidly, it's also given us a great vehicle to being able to have discussions like this on a variety of webinars, and hoping to be able to convey the needs of the restaurant industry into a larger media message that hopefully will bring about change.
Speaking of PPP, I read that, I think it's something like the worker who is laid off or furloughed gets something like $600 plus $545 a week. And one of the questions that they they must be asking is, do I go back to work and potentially make less money, or do I stay on unemployment and, wait this side of thing out? What are you guys seeing at your own respective businesses? Are the staffs generally ready to go back to work if you're open, if you have business for them, or are they kind of on the sidelines like a lot of other folks?
I mean, look, it's hard to compete with $30 an hour that they're receiving for unemployment right now. That's just the reality. That being said, we laid off 4,300 people on March 23rd, and it's a tough day. And we made the decision. We're lucky enough to have a partner in Madison Square Garden Company that's been very supportive, and we made the decision to keep everyone's benefits and to not collect their contribution for the month of April, and we extended that through the month of May. For those people we laid off and those people we put on unpaid leave. But at the end of the day, it was a lot of jobs, a lot of people are out of work. And the one thing that I think we've done a very good job with, aside from being able to pay them for some hours during the first week that we were closed, average hours for the previous 12 months, and then extend their benefits and do some other things. Aside from those things, we've really kept in touch with them. And I think that's been the most important. We created an employee relief fund, and we raised a bunch of money, and we created a 501(c)(3), and then we're granting the hardship grants based on an application process, and we've paid out a bunch of money to a bunch of those employees who are laid off that are really in need. There's some sad stories, and there's some heartbreaking realities that all of us have been going through. I think the one thing that we've done a very good job with is stayed in contact with those employees, so that when we're ready, they're no longer our employees. The laid off employees and the people who are on unpaid leave. And when we go to restart the engine, I think we'll have a lot of those people who will be able to say, hey, you treated us with dignity, you treated us respectfully, you went above and beyond, and you took care of us, and we're ready to come back to work. But I don't think that's any day soon.
There's been a lot of controversy around the PPP program. I think it was something like less than 10% of restaurants in New York that applied actually received any of the money, at least in the first round. Does that sound about right, Stephen?
Our survey is telling us that 92% of restaurants have applied, 20% have received it. And I do think that the next wave of money is meant to be coming in the coming days. And naturally, the big issue with the stimulus package is that you are applying capital to a group of restaurants that don't have the capacity to open, and you're competing against unemployment. So if, as an example, and Tom Colicchio was on the news this morning on one of the talk shows, if you're able to move the date to a point at which it's plausible for restaurants to open, and that's the starting date, that would make a lot more sense. And that way you're getting people off unemployment, you're getting them inside the stores, you're having them help with the reopening and the training. But ultimately, that's the issue. It's moving that date to a large extent. And I think also in the big cities, part of the issue is you have a lot of landlords that are probably participating in this webinar that are saying, what about my rent? And so only 25% of the PPP dollars may be applied to non-payroll expenses. And that's another part of the issue. When you're thinking about New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, some of the larger cities that the Real Deal is involved with and talks about stories on, have much larger rental expenses that these restaurants don't have the capacity to pay that into their landlords. So I think that's another issue.
Would it be beneficial if they move that window, which had been 8 weeks, to say a year to hire back employees? Would that be a big help for you guys?
That is
Getting it to July would be fantastic, but moving it a year would be.
Yeah, that is the fundamental issue for our industry. And I think the reality was they moved very fast with an attempt to, do the right thing. And I think in their minds, the way they built this was it's going to come out in April, in May and June, people will have 2 months where they'll be able to open up. We'll help them through a period where they might have half their employees, but they'll bring on the other half and stabilize. I don't think anyone in Congress fully understood the depth and the time frame, with the best of intents. So the people who were most in need of this, ultimately people who were forced to 100% close, got the least value out of it, if they even got it, because I think the reality is that if you are a business and can work remotely and you're down maybe 20 or 30% of your employees, you are now covering for 8 weeks 70% of your employees, and you're able to hire back the other ones. It works fantastic, but those people are still doing 70% of their business. For retail and restaurants and hospitality that are 100% closed, spending the 8 weeks now barely covers 85% of our staff who are getting equal or better on unemployment for longer. It's actually a disservice to them. And if you offer it to them, you're basically forcing them to take a worse number potentially for less weeks, and committing to that. And it doesn't solve long-term working capital issues at all. And ultimately, those working capital issues for those restaurants is the lifeblood of having a business over the next year or 2 years and having employees. If there's no money when we actually open, how are we able to have employees 6, 9, 12 months down the road? I think a lot of smaller restaurants who are even lucky to get this will use it in a little bit of false hope and may get, devastated when they really need the help, when they're open at 50%, occupancy restrictions and they're devastated from a cash perspective.
And that's when the next wave
about kind of what. I'm sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
No. I think that's when the next wave comes. People have used their PPP dollars, they've reopened, but then again, they're operating not only at 50% occupancy, but with depressed sales. And I think that's really going to be the test of time as to whether or not they're going to be able to make it.
Right. I think the hope and the expectation for a lot of people is big, successful restaurant groups like Tao. And, these are the sorts of companies that are able to raise capital, that have backers, that have longevity. In terms of the little guy, these mom and pop restaurants that Michael, wanted to go to as soon as he gets back to the city, what kind of options do they have in terms of raising money? Are there resources or places that you guys would recommend or something that you see percolating right now?
Well, my recommendation is that we continue through organizations like Stephen's organization and through the New York City Hospitality Alliance and the National Restaurant Association and every other local and federal hospitality industry organization to apply pressure on fixing the guidelines of PPP so that small operators like the owners of LEOs, where I cut my teeth for the first 7 years of the business, that they can use the PPP money in the way that they need it, not by hiring people back to stand around and do nothing for right now, but rather at the end of the year when they're really going to need it, and that's what we should be focused on.
I think Bill's right. We're working a lot with two new organizations, the IRC, who's working hand in hand with the NRA, and ROAR here in New York State, that are focused on a lot of these things and also focused on the things that restaurants will need over the next 2, 3, 4 years and how they can sort of partner in ways with the federal government, the state government, the landlords, because landlords need that balance too. Ultimately, it's bigger than them. The banks and the government have to get involved to find a balance to make sure that these employees have jobs long term. And I think there's been a focus on the small business, big business issue, and I understand absolutely why. But I think one of the big focuses that we're sort of missing, or the nuance is low-income employees, how many of them there are who can find jobs only within restaurant industry, that is their access point, and that employers who can potentially employ many of these people at $15 to $20 an hour, how do we support them in their ability to long-term keep those employees? There are a lot of bigger companies, some of which in the restaurant industry I think were somewhat unfairly maligned here, and I understand why, because the comparison was made from a small restaurant to a big restaurant.
You're referring to Shake Shack and Potbelly.
Yeah, a whole host. And I understand the reasoning that people can react that way, but ultimately, I believe only 9% of this first tranche of PPP loans even went to restaurants in general. So the comparison was a mom and pop restaurant versus a big restaurant, but both restaurants are trying to employ a lot of the people that we want to keep in business. There were a huge amount of businesses that aren't really employing those people, that aren't 100% closed, that ultimately the goal of this was, how can we keep businesses that have a lot of employees? And having a lot of employees is often a low margin state of affairs, but that's who's employing Americans. How do we keep all those businesses, big and small, afloat? Because as we make things more and more technology driven, we're driving those low income jobs away. And the more we unfortunately socially distance on some level, the more we eliminate those jobs. And restaurants and hospitality are one of the rare places where those jobs are still available. So whether it's big or small companies, if they're focused on taking care of that level of employee for America to work, we really need to be able to support all of them. And I think that really has to be a bigger piece of what this focus is about.
James, to your original question, and I would I would answer it a little bit differently, or from a different standpoint. I would tell you, when you think about access to capital, the restaurant industry remains, unfortunately, at a point which they don't have the capacity to borrow money. Banks don't lend money to typical restaurateurs. The folks on this webinar, they stand a little bit different. They have institutional backers, they have high net worth individuals that have invested in them, and they may, and I'm not saying they do, they may have the capacity to walk into a bank and be able to borrow money against past revenues. The reality is that most restaurateurs, 95% of them don't have access to capital. And that's part of the reason that we're going to look to the real estate community in a lot of ways to help them in being creative and coming up in ways for them to be able to foster their growth and to ensure that they're able to remain open. Because, outside of alternative lenders and Square and Squirrel and American Express and credit card processors, there's very few other folks that are willing to lend money to restaurateurs. And if they do it in very small tranches at very high interest rates, which really doesn't further our cause. It really hurts it. And so that's part of why the restaurant industry is in such need of capital through PPP and other forms.
Go ahead.
I think Stephen's right, though. I mean, landlords and real estate is really going to be the answer in a lot of ways. That means that banks have to get involved to make that all make sense. But I think ultimately, if they think out over 10 years and say, is experiential retail like restaurants still the future of these spaces and the driving force to fill our units, and especially our commercial tenants who may otherwise want to stay home? And if they believe those are anchors and amenities to what they're doing, they have a leverage point with all that additional space in the long term. That's different. They have an ability to understand that and to partner with restaurants, big and small. I think that's still a real possibility. I think that's one of ultimately the best ways for restaurateurs to find that balance.
Every crisis finds opportunists, people who look at this landscape and they say, yeah, this looks pretty bad for a lot of people, but I have the money, I have a vision. Does anyone see people buying up huge swaths of restaurants here and there, or any innovative plays upcoming?
I would tell you that the consolidation in the industry is something that's talked about often, has yet to occur. Our indication is that it will occur. I think that you're going to find well-branded restaurant groups that have equity in their name, being in a position to be able to earn themselves effectively a new job and to sell their business to a large organization. I wouldn't say that there's a whole host of capital chasing these deals, but folks from within the restaurant industry are going to look to bring on brands and fill out restaurant concepts that they don't yet have inside their portfolio. But if we're talking in December of 2020, my sense is that you're probably going to have 3 to 4 dozen of these conversations that would have occurred and deals that would have been executed. By any other industry standard, that's a very small number. And the dollar figures are going to be rather small by comparison to other industries. But certainly there will be a lot of consolidation. That's quite a bit of how we're spending our time now, is raising capital for groups that are seeking the opportunity to grow post-pandemic and others that are looking to consolidate and fill out their repertoire of restaurants. And so, to your question, I think that'll be something that you should be looking out for, certainly.
Okay. I've got just 1 or 2 questions. We're already at 50 minutes and it only feels like it's been 20 minutes. There's so much to discuss. And I think this is one of the highest webinars in terms of participation yet. So it's good to see. First question here is, thinking beyond conventions and corporate events, do you foresee a medium-term structural decline in air travel? And how can you adapt to impacts from a declining leisure travel market? Michael, Bill, could either of you speak to this?
I mean, I'll just say that we're very concerned, as I said before, that the convention business is, already been decimated through the summer. All the big conventions have canceled through the summer in Las Vegas, basically. Everybody says they're rescheduling for October. I'm not sure how that's going to work because there's not the room for everybody in October. So I think we're going to lose a lot of those conventions. I'm worried about that, and that's directly related to the air travel question. Also in New York, I think the last piece that's going to come back is the foreign tourists, and it's a huge part of our business in New York. And a huge part of the influx of people coming and spending money in our industry in New York. So I'm worried about that, and I think that we are going to take a hit for sure.
I agree with Bill that I think short term, I think, I talk to a lot of landlords and other people who say, let's talk about what you need for the next 2 or 3 months. And I think we're talking about a couple of years here, not a couple of months. But I do believe long term, New York is super resilient as an example. There are a lot of places like New York City that are still a dynamic destination that always will be. And after September 11, a lot of people said it will never be the same. People won't want to live in New York. People won't want to travel to New York, but New Yorkers are resilient. And I think the human nature to want to see tremendous places, to want to travel and see exciting things is fundamental. And the more I think the more we are working from home, the more we are focused, on doing things digitally, the more there's still moments that leisure and travel and restaurants are even more fundamentally important to humans who are social animals. And I think ultimately those will become even more powerful points, because I think while there will be a percentage of people who will start to shop more and work more at home, there will be even more a demand, I think, in the long term for what those travel and social energizing things do. So I think it's understanding, how do you play the long game and what's the 5 or 10 year play, and why restaurants can be so dynamic in that, but recognizing how profound the next few years could be. And finding partnerships and abilities and being safe in how you handle that with the best of intents, for your landlords, for your employees, wanting to be good to all of them now, but wanting to think conservatively so you can be there for the long term.
Yeah.
I think that's just about that. This has been a really illuminating, interesting, fantastic discussion. I hope to go to all of your restaurants, maybe later this year in 2020. I had a reservation to Le Bernardin in June, so I don't think that's going to happen. But Nevertheless, thank you guys so much, Michael.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
You guys are fantastic.
Appreciate it.
Steven. Thanks, Michael. Steven,
Take care.
hook me up with Michael so I can reach out to him and let's stay in touch since all of us are out east.
You
Nice
got it.
just to chat. All right?
Thank
Good.
you. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
All right, and everybody, we're doing this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. This is TRD Talks Live, so stick back and or come back again, and we'll see you on Wednesday.